Two more people coming in. I mean, the way this could act as a two-part undertaking from last week to this week. It's sort of common territory. It's something which a lot of people are preoccupied with right now. We're going to start reading today. We'd like to start reading.
I'm happy to start as I have to drop off early tonight. So I'll start. Sacrifice, limit, rupture, abjection, brutality, death, force, power, violence, pathos, repression, shock, trauma. Wars are continual, but it is only when they surface into the visible realm that they become named. Wars can be virtual, economic, like forms of saturation, dissuasion, or intensities, but all under the radar of recognition. The old division of cold and hot wars indicated a sense of this, but there are so many other terms that could be added. In her 2024 exhibition, how do you pronounce
Marcius.
In her 2024 exhibition, Mourning Marsyas, Marlene Dumas utilizes a mythical event from Ovid's poetical work Metamorphosis. Rather than produce an exhibition which contained the didactic critique of the present, she elected a more allegorical and thus indirect route to the immediacy of war. Mourning. Sorry, how do you pronounce it again?
Marcius.
Mourning Marsyas, 2024. The time of objection is double, a time of oblivion and thunder, a veiled infinity and the moment when revelation bursts forth. Julia Kristeva.
This is it's a persistent subject matter which goes back to this goes back to the Roman copy of the Greek original, and it's Peter Paul Rubens. This is Titian Marcius from the 1570s. It was in his studio at the time of his death. He died of the plague in 1576. But it shows Marcius being flayed, and there's a double figure. The person crouching down doing the flaying is meant to be Apollo, as well as the figure playing the instrument on the left-hand side. So the Apollinarian principle is both links beauty to violence, is both aspects, and the figure with his hand over his mouth is King Midas, but it's also a portrait of Titian, so it's Titian himself meditating upon this scene. So it's a kind of, could be an allegory about the relationship between the Apollinarian principle of art and the Dionysian. And as a Venetian painting, Titian was inclined towards the Dionysian principle of art rather than the Apollinarian, which is more Florentine and line, and so it's a dissolution of form. So the flayed figure is on the edge of becoming formless, and in the story it creates a river. A river Marsis is formed out of the remains of the flaying, the water being poured over him with the blood, creates a fresh spring. So it's a redemptive story. So in a sense that the one who's sacrificed often gives rise to a redemptive outcome. but it's one of the most radical paintings of the whole Renaissance. Or I mean, it's slightly within the Mannerist period, but it's almost no perspectival space. It's um, very modern pictorial space, which is doesn't come into European painting until the back into European painting until, let's say, Picasso de Damisol. You get a similar figural arrangement, a kind of similar compression of space. This is Marlon Dumas, a work called War in this exhibition. Two fragments of portraits. Marlon Dumas, The Devil May Care, from 2024, so in the exhibition. Does anyone who went to the exhibition, have they got anything to add? We did a visit. There was about 10 of us who saw this exhibition. Has anyone got any afterthoughts? I mean, it seems that it's an exhibition which opened out a space for thinking about war indirectly, not just as an event, but also as a kind of what war is.
Greek pottery depicting the war between the Persians and the Greeks.
So it's one of the earliest recorded wars in pottery and in writing and in poetry.
The Greco-Persian early conflicts 492 to 445 BC were wars that left a record of inscriptions in the form of pottery, sculpture, and written documents.
There's a mask of early Greek fighting mask. This is a Greek sculpture of a Persian soldier.
This Greek sculpture depicts a Persian soldier in a fighting pose. As opposed to an art form that diminishes the other as an enemy, it is instead rendered noble in its formal features. Heracles.
So depiction of Alexander the Great.
Alexander the Great fought a succession of wars between 336 and 323 BC. After his victory against the Achaemenid Empire, he extended his conquests as far as the region of the Punjab. The empire that he built stretched over much of the known world of this period. Paolo Uccello, The Battle of San Romano, 1432, the war between city-states.
So it's between the Sinis and the Florentines. The Florentines won the victory. So it's one of the there's different versions of this painting. This one is in the National Gallery, which will be brought out again when the National Gallery opens its new wing in the spring. It's really interesting painting. Just a minute.
Jonathan, I actually saw it in the National Gallery at the weekend. It's on display, yeah.
It's magnificent, isn't it?
It is. It's such a large piece as well, so it makes a huge presence.
And it's got a double visuality. It looks like it's something which is based upon tapestries, as much as being in one of the earliest forms of experiments in perspectival rendering of space. So it has this sort of pattern which runs across the surface, which is all to do with these medallions, gold medallions. And it's also got depth, so it's kind of got a strong push and pull between horizontality and depth. I'll have to go and see it again. I've not seen it for some time.
Sanwala, Bhuwani, and Tulsi. Victory of the Imperial Mughal army over Sultan Adam. Akbarnama, 1590 to 95.
So this is a completely different sort of spatial encounter. It sort of looks chaotic, whereas the Uccello, which is earlier, looks ordered. This is sort of almost a chaos. So it's a mixture of formal spatial diagrams, really. So it's showing the simultaneity of war. It's not one image, it's multiple image or a multiplicity of image. So it includes temporality within the spatial encounter.
Peter Paul Rubens, Consequences of War, 1637 to 8.
I mean, in a way, it's still painting a mythical relationship to war, which, in a way, is a technique or something which later on Picasso utilizes in the painting Guernica. It's more mythical. It's more a mythical representation or presentation than modern.
Goya, the 3rd of May, 1808.
It's one of the first great modernist depictions of war. So when the Spanish invaded, when the French invaded Spain,
Goya's exposure of the brutality of war have come to transcend their own historical context to reflect a resistance to war in general.
this is Delacroix, Liberty Leading the People.
In this painting that depicts the subject, Liberty Leading the People, Delacroix embolizes the figure of liberty as a symbol of the becoming of the French Republic. In this, she is conceived both as an allegorical goddess-like figure and a robust woman of the people. The painting both represented an exact historical moment, but also became a way of figuring the spirit of revolution in more general terms. In Géricault's work, The Colonial War, A Black on a Prancing Horse, there is a connection to the energetics of the North African scene.
Jericho.
Henry Rousseau, War, 1898. Alberto Boccioni painted The Cavalry Charge in 1914. Boccioni was to die in the war, but Marinetti continued to enthuse about war and its lurid beauty of speed, danger, and sounds. Gino Severini, The Armored Train, 1915. Paul Nash, The Men in Road, 1919.
I mean, the First World War was a real shock to I mean, the extent of the devastation. was never understood before. Trench warfare and mechanical warfare kind of meeting to create a kind of absolute devastation, both of men and mainly men and landscape. Nash saw both wars, was a war artist in the First World War and the Second World War.
C.R.W. Nevinson, The Paths of Glory, 1917. First World War was termed the Great War or the War to End All Wars. It marked the transition from frontal battles based on cavalry charges to static trench mechanized combat. The losses were huge due to the scale of the weapons that were deployed.
Deployed is better than developed.
Max Beckmann, The Night, 1918 to 19.
It's noticeable you get this this fracturing of space in expressionist painting and in futurist painting and cubist painting. And this compression of space, so bodies and space kind of intertwined in all sorts of unlikely combinations.
Kathy Kollwitz, Memorial for Karl Liebknecht, 1920.
Karl Liebknecht was and Rosa Luxemburg were part of the Spartacus movement, which were repressed after the Russian Revolution. They were both assassinated.
So I think somebody else should have the opportunity of reading here, I think.
Thank you. That's great. Who's next?
Okay,
Ari. Oh, all right.
Please go ahead.
Okay. Otto Dix, The War Triptych, 1929 to 1932.
Interesting how he uses a great religious structure or triptych form, which is mainly used in a religious context. This is John Hartfield.
John Hartfield developed photomontage as a means of spreading his anti-Nazi and anti-war message. Many of these works were created for the journal AJZ, so they received a mass repection audience.
That's a spelling. I'll have to correct that. Mass reception.
Right. Battleship Potemkin, 1925, presents an enactment of a mutiny that occurred in 1905. This face became an enduring symbol of this imaginative reconstruction.
So this is the scenes on the Odessa steps where the protesters are slaughtered. And that's from the famous, the face is from that famous scene where she's shot in the eye. This is a poster for the film Battleship of Potemkin by Rodchenko. This is kind of got cubist elements, but it's also got the modernist graphical format.
Guernica was painted in response of Franco's aerial attack on a small Republican town. This atrocity also served to indicate a shift in modern warfare with its attack on a civilian population. The iconography Picasso elected to employ was that of ancient warfare, so it drew upon a universalizing sense to the stance taken. The painting was retained in exile in New York until Spain became a democracy. Pablo Picasso, Guernica, 1937.
Who's seen the painting in Madrid now? No one's seen it.
Yeah, I saw it.
I mean, it's huge, isn't it?
Yeah.
Do you think it's fallen outside of its time, or do you think it's retained its power? Do you think his strategy of using almost mythical ancient contexts of figures have retained a kind of power, which is, or do you think it's a sort of slightly arcane or depiction?
I mean, I think specifically because it's decontextualized like that, it maintains a kind of timelessness. It has a kind of quite arresting crudity to it, which, is quite an idiosyncratic way of showing violence, but it's really, palpable. Robert Capa's The Falling Soldier, 1936, became emblematic of the power of documentary photography to create an image of war. It shows the moment when a loyalist soldier was shot. The authenticity of this photograph has been questioned in some quarters.
Quite controversial. I mean, some will believe he staged it, but it's one of the most enduring images of the Spanish Civil War, as is Picasso's The Guernica. There's Mao on a long march. He's lecturing on cold guerrilla warfare, prolonged war, protracted war. Sorry.
On protracted war, Mao, 1938. Our strategy should be to employ our main forces to operate over an extended and fluid front. To achieve success, Chinese forces must conduct their warfare with a high degree of mobility on extensive battlefields. This means large-scale mobile warfare and not positional warfare. It does not mean the abandonment of all the vital strategic points, which should be defended by positional warfare as long as possible. Positional warfare is necessary, but strategically it is auxiliary and secondary. Beat the White with the Red Wedge, 1919. L. Lissitzky, 1941. Rodchenko had a vision of how warfare would develop technologically, including chemical war. His style of work grew out of Cubo-futurism, so embraced modernism despite the dominance of socialist realism that became dominant in the early 1930s onwards.
In 1930, I think 1934, the social realism was indicated as a national style of art or a national position. It was sort of opposed to modernists. So it's a kind of social realism as proposed by critics like George Lukács had a sort of totalizing dimension to it, which modernist fragmentation didn't have.
Max Ernst, Europe After the Rain, 1940 to 42.
He travelled to Indochina before the war in a menage a trois with Paul Eluard and Paul Eluard's wife. But he was he went to see the ruins of Angkor Wat and retained this image of the jungle eating the ruins. So he had this as an image of war.
Shoes of Nazi concentration camp victims. This image has a power because it serves to point out a reality that is almost beyond direct representation. Each of the shoes represents a person who was annihilated as so much raw matter that could be efficiently dispensed with.
The image of Dhaka.
Lee Miller entered the Second World War as a photographer attached to American forces. She photographed inside Dachau at the time of liberation. This was in stark contrast to her work as both a fashion and avant-garde art photographer. The photograph of her sitting in Hitler's bath captured her metaphorically washing away the dirt of the war. David Sherman, Lee Miller in Hitler's bath, 1945.
She arranged it wasn't documentary in the sense that she arranged this sculptural figure next to the bath and a picture of Hitler, photograph of Hitler. So it was a carefully composed image, as well as a spontaneous need to have a bath.
Lee Miller, woman accused of collaborating with the Germans, Rennes, France, 1944.
This is Henry Moore's drawings of the Second World War on the underground.
Henry Moore was employed as a war artist, and much of his work was focused on the underground, which was used as a retreat from the nighttime bombing raids.
This is various, it's the Matzos at the centre. But it's all the artists who went into exile.
Artists invariably sought exile from wars, and this was particularly the case with the advent of World War II, when artists fled from Europe to the United States. This in turn made New York into the center of the ongoing modernist experiment. War films both document actual war, but also create an imaginary projection of both wars, of the past, and the image of wars, which are of the future. Akira Kurosawa, Seven Samurai, 1954. La Jetée, 1962, director Chris Marker, is an unusual science fiction film that is set in Paris after the advent of World War III. It consists of still images except for one brief passage, and the narrative poses the issue of escape from the present for another future elsewhere from the Earth. Dr. Strangelove, 1964, director Stanley Kubrick, is a political satire of the Cold War. It features Peter Sellers, who plays 3 different roles. The film ends with a montage of nuclear explosions.
It's one of the shots of the underground control room.
Lawrence of Arabia, 1962, director David Lean, was based upon T.E. Lawrence's book, The Seven Pillars of Wisdom, 1926. It depicts the war fought against Ottoman forces in Arabia. The film The Battle of Algiers, 1966, portrays the War of Independence against French colonization. The film has the appearance of a documentary, and the scenes of violence are unflinching in their close-up encounter. Such was its realism, it was used in the training by the Americans for the Iraq War. Jean-Luc Godard's film Weekend, 1967, portrays the capitalist spectacle at its abject limit. The car crash has the appearance of a war scene, and the urban guerrillas anticipate the breakdown which is going to occur as an outcome of May 68. Apocalypse Now, 1979, stages a journey into the dark interior of Cambodia in order to eliminate Colonel Kurtz. In part, the film is based on Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, but also on various episodes drawn from the war in Indochina. Kurtz signifies a character who has passed through all limits, touching through the threshold of horror, and facing his own death, he simply reiterates the words, "The horror, the horror."
Kurtz was played by Marlon Brando.
The Red Detachment of Women was firstly a film, 1961, and then a ballet, 1971. The Battle at Lake Changjin is the highest grossing film in Chinese history.
That's the Korean War.
After the Cuban Revolution, there was a movement producing posters which generated a popular art form that became the image of the revolution. Shomi Tomatsu, Atomic War Damage, Nagasaki, 1961.
He was commissioned to do a photographic depiction of the war or the bomb, and he elected to just show fragments. And this is a pocket watch which was captured the moment when the explosion occurred. He believed he could only get an accurate depiction through tiny fragments, morsels, fragments, traces.
The Vietnam War became known as the TV War because there was daily reports of it every evening. Some claim that the war was won and lost on TV. Rita Donna, Aftermath, 1976.
This was after Bloody Sunday in Northern Ireland, and sort of drawing she made.
Leon Golub, Mercenaries 11, 1979.
In massive paintings on top, industrial tarpaulins.
Leon Golub produced a series of monumental paintings that attempted to portray the secret wars that were occurring, particularly in Latin and Central America. These wars invariably escaped official modes of sanction, but were marked by their brutality.
They're indirectly run by the CIA or not necessarily indirectly.
The Angola Mercenaries 5, 1984.
He showed these in London, and the Sashi bought some of them, but the Tate didn't buy, which was I mean, sometimes did very surprising choices, but he got things right very often in a way that the Tate Gallery didn't.
Nancy Sparrow, Maypole Take No Prisoners, to 2008. Sigmar Polk, Watchtower, 1984.
So he's part of the capitalist realist group. So they opposed they were born in and grew up in East Germany, but they opposed social realism, but they also opposed American pop art. So I wanted to create a kind of aesthetic which was, you could say, our sardonic realism.
The capitalist realist group produced an aesthetic template that was in opposition to social realism, but equally to American pop art. Both Richter and Polk started their development in East Germany, so they were working with different memory systems due to their cultural position.
This is a painting by Richter of you can read it here.
In a series of 15 paintings called October the 18th, 1977, Gerhard Richter attempted to represent the most highly emotive and contended series of events in post-war German history. The overall work was completed in 1988 and was constructed out of video footage, press cuttings, police archive photographs relating to the activities of the Red Army faction, RAF, or Baader-Meinhof group, from which a process of editing occurred in order to create the series. As a series, they constitute a form of history painting that had largely disappeared within modernity. The fact that they were created 10 years after the events in Stammheim prison also introduced the working of memory upon historical events, and the characteristically blurred style of the photographically based paintings are a way of signaling this dimension.
Strange enough, they were sold to the Museum of Modern Art in New York. They don't remain in Germany.
Sigmar Polk had a close connection to Afghanistan, and he produced an exhibition at the Tate Modern on this theme. Kiefer, Eisensteig, Iron Path, 1986.
So it's the photographic, based on a photograph of the railway, which was a one-way traffic to concentration camp to Auschwitz.
Simon Norfolk's photograph Track of a Destroyed Taliban Tank, 2001 to 2, has the appearance of the backbone of prehistorical skeleton. In a series of depictions that were shot in Afghanistan in the war against Soviet forces, in the war against Soviet forces are not directly represented. Instead, there are buildings of the aftermath. Simon Norfolk. there was a whole number of photojournalists who would be flown out to conflict zones in order to produce an extended photographic coverage. They invariably each possessed an ethical code with which to carry out such missions. But there was in turn a public recognition that the truth, or a truth, as being depicted. The photographer Sebastio Salgado films intensively in each situation he enters. This photograph is from Kuwait in 1991 and depicts the aftermath of Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. This series of images was sponsored by New York Times magazine.
This is shot in Angola. MPLA was a resistance movement to the Portuguese colonies. It depicts someone who was shot as a traitor or as a
Late modern art invariably falls short of the demand made by it when facing up to the questions and reality of war. Either it tends to fall into easy didactism, or alternatively, elect for the rhetoric of the sublime, but both tend towards a loss of the real. Jack Goldstein, Untitled, Burning City, 1981.
That's an example of something which inclines towards a kind of almost a vacancy of the sublime. A airbrush painting.
Robert Longo, Study of Gaza Fire, 2018.
Robert Longo showing at the moment at the Ropek Gallery.
Robert Longo's Study for Jet Pilot Helmet, 2009, was part of a series which emblemizing the hyperreality of war design. The war carpets of Afghanistan replaced traditional forms of pattern with weapons that were employed firstly by the Soviet war machine and then America. They were a way of using tradition to portray the new reality of modern warfare, but without bodies.
So it happens to be a small exhibition on at the British Museum, which has some of these carpets.
Are these carpets the products of such a war-soaked reality that has infiltrated the vestiges even of hundreds of years of cultural tradition? If so, does this then signify a final stage of abstracting life forms as a cultural reality? Surely there is something bleak in this that stretches this process of absorption to the limit. The patterns of war are estranged from the lived reality of war. Patterns of war tend to mix easily with an account based upon facts. Are we as a culture defining war as part of or into the design of the overall culture to the extent that it might creep into our cultural artifacts? Weapons assume a fetish power as the superproducts of hyperreality that these carpets appear to provide the visual facade or presence for. Wars are increasingly totalizing in their impact. They infiltrate every vector of the social body and injure every aspect of the political matrix. They combine visible violence with forms of invisible dissuasion. Nothing is left undone in the design of each operation, with multiple modes of calculation ever alert to new possibilities of advantage. Barbara Kruger, Untitled War Without End, 2008. All of us are already civilian soldiers without knowing it. The great stroke of luck for the military class's terrorism is that no one recognizes it. People don't recognize the militarized part of their identity, of their consciousness. Paul Virilio. She told me that culture is the air that we breathe, and I said this is true of war also. I then said that the war has already started because the heat of accompanying this has become detectable. At times like this, you become sensitive to wind directions, he told her in a hushed tone. This is the feeling that usually indicated that it was time to move, but there is now nowhere to go. Or there's nowhere to go now.
What questions, thoughts?
Jonathan, could I just ask, was that last quotation your own writing, or what was the, that was your own writing? It's really interesting.
I think sometimes you've got to fictionalize. Did you have thoughts from last week which you'd like to carry forward?
I was just wondering, just the last few slides, is it kind of implying that now there's a kind of greater degree of complicity in us as kind of active kind of members of society, more so than there would have been in earlier wars, like let's say World War II, World War One, or something like that? Is there a kind of is there a degree of complicity that comes with our you know, ability to be able to see things happen in real time?
I mean, I just think there's things we just don't see. We don't recognize what it is that's happening. I mean, I think I elected to focus on that. It's not really even a formal exhibition in the British Museum, but it's a kind of attempt to make a relevant statement about the present. I wonder if there's something quite shocking about those artifacts, which we're not alert to. We just take it as a matter of fact. It was a brutal war, and carpets were made as is it a protest, or is it a piece of advantageous business, or what is it? I mean, there's thresholds. I mean, the present war in Gaza is never as a population, civilian population, been so not just brutalized, but defined as a as an enemy to be eliminated. I mean, nothing's an accident in that war. There's no accidental death. They're all there by design. I mean, if we take the First World War, which was absolutely brutal, it was mainly soldiers who died. There wasn't massive numbers of children who were brought into the equation. But progressively, wars have increasingly involved civilian populations and being seen as a need to strategically do something with populations, civilian populations. So they become front line. So this idea that forces are hiding behind civilians might have a certain truth, but it's also a kind of points out the reality of the wars which are being fought.
I suppose I'm a bit caught between it seems like there are maybe two questions for me going on, just very, very broad questions, and I'm not sure how they relate to each other, and because I think they can get caught in a kind of circle, which is the effect of war on art making, and as in how one acts on the other. So how the attempt to represent a war challenges what how your usual kind of modes of representation, and then how well maybe so yeah maybe I'm actually just confused. Maybe it's not a thing. I was thinking art on war and then war on art kind of thing. But I don't know. Sorry. I'm just actually not being very helpful. But I think also something else that I found really, really interesting about Alex's talk last week was that and that you were talking about as well was this modernism about the kind of sublime not being able to talk to the silence or a kind of but the fact that that kind of silence or nothingness was maybe taking a different form or not being useful, or you were kind of, I don't know, I wasn't really that sure of what to make of it, that kind of the kind of ecstasy in Alex's poems and things like that. There's just there was, I don't know, I was wondering whether you could maybe say something about that a bit. And I'm sorry that I've just been so blabbering, but I feel like there's just something that's also quite hard. It's quite hard to talk about. You know what I mean? I don't know. I find it quite hard to talk about. Anyway, sorry, I'm going to stop. Jesus, bye.
I mean, there is a sort of fallback on sublimity very often in depictions of war. It seems to be a ready-made form of rhetoric, which indicates the beyond of representation, the excess, the lack of limit, the awe, the inability to speak after, just the sense of the wow, the sort of basic overcoming of rationality. So it seems an easy option at times, one which isn't. I mean, if we go through this, sort of, as this did a sort of very quick, over a quick period of time, over a vast period of time, very quick recall. There aren't many really significant paintings. You'd expect them to be more. I mean, when Picasso decided to paint, he must have computed very quickly what he could do and what he couldn't do. He elected a fairly obscure way of depiction, but it wasn't surprising in the end. It's not. I mean, it's not sublime. It's sort of archaic. It's archaic. So you get these different temporal registers. Like, did the Robert Capa photograph become more of a symbol of the Spanish Civil War than Picasso's Guernica? And if so, what's the possibility of it being a fake image? We're much more inclined to look at things as the potential of having a simulation of a situation, a ready-made image which would get a response. I think the figure of Lee Miller is extraordinary. I mean, she worked with avant-garde techniques of photography and fashion photography in Vogue. And yet when the war happened, she was one of the 4 war photographers attached to American forces going into Europe. And she was at Dakar when the gates were opened, when the Americans opened the gates. And she didn't, I mean, she showed some of the photographs, but hid most of them away. And her life reads as a war story. When she was very young, she was raped. And but she, in the post-war years, couldn't retain a relationship to these photographs. They were too dreadful. So it's when we have a kind of narrative like that that we, I think, also the paintings of the underground or hidden wars in Central America mainly are very powerful. But there are very few examples. I wonder if in writing it's more successful. I mean, do we, for instance, go in the same way to the war poems of, let's say, Wilfred Owen, and think they, for want of a better word, get it right? I also want to pick up on the present and the fact that, not the fact, the suspicion that the war's already beginning, or it started. It's not the way war is fought now is largely invisible. But it's hot already. It's not a cold war, it's a hot war. And we'll find this out if Trump's elected. It will be the rearrangement of all the battle lines in the world. I was also interested in Mao's protracted war, theory of protracted war, that Chinese thinking about strategic matters in the world is based very much on Mao's theories of warfare, starting fires in the enemy's camp, wearing the enemy down, taking a long term. There's a famous story where Chou Enlai, when he met up with American diplomats or journalists, was asked, what did he think about the French Revolution? And he said, it's very interesting, but it's too early to say what the consequences are. So we have different temporal lines which are drawn. When Americans wanted to fight a war in Afghanistan, they bought all the existing maps they could find. They thought they could conquer them spatially, but they forgot that there's a temporal map, that the Afghans had successfully fought wars over the centuries against foreign forces. And that they had a map of time which would be a resistance to the present. So there's a sense of not understanding a culture. I had a friend, a colleague once, who used to buy carpets in Afghanistan. This is before wars occurred, and he would go into remote areas, and he'd often get involved in discussions about whether the world's round or flat. And the village elders were arguing that the world was flat. But they would also talk about how their great-great-grandfathers knew Alexander the Great, or had met Alexander the Great, and that it wasn't a big deal to recall 2,500 years of history. That's small time, or it's time which is still in reach of a memory body of tribal reality in Afghanistan. When you think of all those troops in Vietnam who didn't have a clue about the enemy they were fighting, didn't understand that it didn't matter how long it would take, they'd be worn out and worn down. They didn't have a capacity to fight a people who have gone back generations and fought wars. And after the Americans had left, the Chinese wanted to give a lesson militarily to the Vietnamese, but lost, got beaten back by the Vietnamese. So it's a bit of a ramble.
I was just wondering, Jonathan, you said, there's been no great paintings done, to sort of give a sense of the horror of, a current or ongoing war or something in very recent history. Do you think that, with the kind of level of image saturation and desensitization we've had, do you think there's still potential for a history painting like that to have the same kind of impact?
I don't think there is. I think that's what's at stake. That's why Goya stands out.
I mean, do you think that there was like a kind of nobility in the role of an artist that there isn't now as well? I mean, at that time, that meant that the painting could have a bit more kind of gravitas, probably.
Well, authenticity has become a sort of slightly jaded word, hasn't it?
I mean, the thing that our world is such a compromised structure, I couldn't see anything coming out of it that wouldn't be received with, total skepticism.
But you can't avoid the possible reality that, in hindsight, it's going to look a very indulgent period in the art world for the last 30 years.
It's interesting to think about the time sometimes that it takes. I was interested in the dates of some of particularly the films that you were showing in your presentation. So Lawrence of Arabia, 1962, to cinematically portray a book written in 1925 about Lawrence's experiences in 1916, 17. And Apocalypse Now, 1979, so sort of 10 years really after the peak of the Vietnam War. And there have been films. I was interested when you mentioned, actually I can't remember which one it was now, but one of the films that was used, the Battle of Algiers, for training purposes because it was deemed so realistic. I remember in 2006, the film Black Hawk Down, which is about US helicopters that get Black Hawks that get shot down in Mogadishu in Somalia, which would have been in the mid 1990s, 1996, and that was that film was made, I think, in the early 2000s and was being used because it's so realistic in terms of combat first aid. It was being used for first aid training, and yeah, and when I think about, say, even sort of some really powerful literary representations of war, Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five, about the bombing of Dresden at the end of World War II, was published in the late 1960s. Catch-22, Joseph Heller's remarkably funny book about the Second World War, took about 20 years. And even the sort of the First World War, Robert Graves's Goodbye to All That, 10 years later, All Quiet on the Western Front. I think that was also 1928-29. And then even something as kind of colossally, catastrophically horrific as the Holocaust. Now, of course, Holocaust studies is a sort of major discipline and concern within academia and culture more broadly. But that only really, in terms of people starting to kind of write academic books, it was documented in the early years by the American military, but it was only sort of almost 30 years later, 70s, 80s, and then by the 90s, sort of trauma studies had become kind of a thing. And so it's kind of interesting, partly to maybe sort of link that to that sort of earlier question about art on war, war and art, which I think is an interesting kind of distinction to think about. That there is, in some instances, not in Picasso's instance, in terms of Guernica, he was maybe slightly kind of at least geographically dislocated from the kind of trauma of what was going on. But in some cases, there's this interesting kind of silence of maybe sort of 20 years while people are trying to, I say people, kind of creative people who've been through that experience, maybe trying to kind of work out what actually, what happened. And maybe that kind of period of silence kind of creates its own sublimity that you talked about. But maybe it's only when you've seen the next war that you can look back on the war that you've just had and kind of start to understand it. And if people haven't experienced the last war, then they don't maybe have the images of the current one. But there was also just, I think, a couple of quotations which I sort of remembered. So, one is from the military, which is this adage that we're always fighting the last war, because that's where the sort of the technology and the lessons are learned from. So we're kind of, in a sense, always losing the current one. And then in terms of your mentioning of Afghanistan and time, I think it's attributed to Massoud, who was the leader of the Northern Alliance during the 1980s, when Soviet Union then was defeated, and he said, they have the watches, but we have the time, which I've always thought was kind of a good quotation. And then finally, I kind of reflecting on the carpets that you were talking about in Afghanistan, in that sort of confusion about, is this kitsch, or is this sort of post-traumatic, or is this commercialism? I remember in Ashrafia, which is actually quite a upmarket district of Beirut, there was a bar called 1975, where there were no seats, but there were sandbags. And you sit on sandbags and have a beer or a drink or whatever. And the tables were these kind of metal US military kit trunks. The US Marines were, that 1975 relates to the one of the Lebanese civil wars, and the US Marines barracks was hit, and it was, I think, pre 9/11 was the largest loss of US military outside of in one particular bombing, I think. But that bar then became, you wonder, like, why was it set up? Because people are sort of so on the edge, they have to kind of make a joke of it. But then the joke becomes a sort of a destination. But there was a sort of a link there.
Yeah, so maybe it's right that the issue of temporality is too complex for painting to really successfully navigate, and that film is a more appropriate medium. It's a more totalizing apparatus.
I suppose it may be, I mean that question of kind of art on war, war on art. I mean, the art of the 1920s or even the 1910s is, you were drawing attention to the fragmentation, the compression, the sort of time dislocation, even in that kind of much older painting. Is it a tapestry, or is it a perspectival painting? This kind of crushing together of different approaches. Maybe you did choose a few handful of poems, but paintings. But I don't know. I would think of sort of Black Square or Futurism in general, or kind of the De Stijl movement. This total kind of erasure of figuration, all as kind of war art. But in terms of the sort of the ethical kind of question as well, I mean, that is interesting. I sense that there's that you have a sense. I mean, I have that too, that maybe the sort of contemporary culture hasn't kind of represented the horror in the way that Kurtz might suggest it should be. But I mean, I also recall being part of a research team, research group at Oxford University, 2017, 2018, funded as part of the kind of 100 years anniversary of the end of the First World War. And it was called something like, it was a one-year research project called something like Post-War Remembrance and Reconciliation. And I remember all of these sort of academics, hundreds over the course of the year, there were these sort of seminars and lectures and presentations, all of these really, really, highly analytically trained, brilliant academics from around the world talking about how art, academia, culture was going to prevent wars from happening and create peace. And there was a book that came out probably about 20 years ago now called Cruel Britannia, which pointed out that since the Romans arrived, either on our own soil or overseas, Britain has never not been involved in a war in any one given year. And there are only something like 3 or 4 countries that Britain hasn't been involved in a war in. I think one was Tajikistan. And this, so if you look at the sort of statistics, it's not going to stop. And so I find it kind of interesting that these kind of quite analytically, statistically informed academics were either pretending just for the benefit of the Mellon Sawyer funded research project, or genuinely existed in some kind of delusional space that the entirety of Homo sapiens history was going to suddenly change and we were going to live in peace. And so I wonder whether the sort of indulgence that you're talking about maybe over the last 30 years, a bit like sort of the indulgence of the 30-year period of the Borgias murdering terroristic regime that was mentioned in Third Man last week. I don't know, maybe indulgence is a form of kind of war art. Maybe that's the best we can do.
There's an interesting anecdote when the Iraq War was being debated, whether to go to war or not in New York. There's a reproduction of the tapestry, I think, of Picasso's Guernica, which hangs in the UN, and they actually covered it at the time of the debate. So I think that's sort of a kind of indication that something can still retain a kind of force to it. I doubt, covered or uncovered, it would have stopped the vote falling in the way it fell. I've been watching some of these documentaries on the Vietnam War, because when I was growing up, it was extraordinary. Every night there was something on Vietnam and the news. Not as much as in the States, but there's a lot in Britain. But it sort of politicized a generation. It defined whether you're for or against the war, defined where you were in the culture. There was a lot of literature, a lot of writing, a lot of plays, a lot of films on Vietnam. I remember as a 16-year-old seeing Far From Vietnam, which was organized by Chris Marker and Godard and Chabrol. They each made a short film as part of a collective of opposition to the war. I think I was 16 when I saw that. And then I remember coming to London. I came to London in 1969. And by, I think, 1970, I was watching Battle of Algiers and being absolutely staggered by it. I mean, it shocked me to the core. It was one of the greatest anti-colonial films of all time. I mean, come to think of it, I feel that I was born in 51 and the main cultural activity was making model aeroplanes, Spitfires and Hurricanes and Stukas and battleships. The most expensive battleship you could buy in kit form was Bismarck. But the culture was obsessed by war, and most of the films were war films or cowboy films. And even popular entertainment. I remember on Saturday afternoon there was wrestling, and the most popular wrestler was a man called Billy Two Rivers. He wasn't an American Indian at all. He was a northern entertainer, but he had a Mohican and a haircut, and he would get beaten around the ring, and then he would suddenly go into a war dance, and everyone roared with delight, and he'd always win. But I mean, all these factors which saturated you with war. And then, as I say, the Vietnam War was a daily preoccupation. And it went on. The decision to go to Iraq, the war in Iraq, was one of the great turning points in the culture, that they could do that. Well, one of the first conversations I had when I went to college was with this Indian who was trained to be a lawyer. and he was in the Naxalite movement, which is a Maoist movement in India. So it's extraordinary. You're meeting people from guerrilla movements at college and I mean, so-called terrorist organizations now.